mother. He owned the building. His loft apartment was right above his business, and he was the only person who lived in the building, a fact he would be a great deal more grateful for when he returned to it. He'd been talked into the renovation when he'd been seeing an interior designer, Angelica. He'd already known they weren't going anywhere as a couple, and so had she. They both had extraordinarily demanding professional lives, the pitter-patter of little feet not even a blip on either of their radars. But he had liked the bachelor chic of her design, a design notably lacking a Swarovski crystal chandelier. The renovation had now outlasted the relationship by several weeks. The breakup had been amiable, as were most of his breakups. When he had complained to the manager about the noise in 602 for the third time, Mrs. Bulittle had sniffed and said, "It's not as if Mr. Wilson hasn't had a noisy party or two." Daniel was pretty sure he'd heard the slightest touch of smugness in her voice, which was possible since Mrs. Bulittle lived directly below 502, in 402. She had no doubt suffered a night or two of lost sleep herself, since Daniel could vouch for the noisiness of several parties he had attended in this very apartment. Ah, he and Kevin had enviable lives. Successful 30-somethings, unattached, and pretty much devoted to keeping it that way, much to the chagrin of both their mothers. "Daniel, where are you staying during the reno of your loft? I can't reach you. Is this any way to treat your mother?" "Mom, I'm fine, just busy." He followed that with a couple of heart symbols. He liked texting. You could have the pretext of intimacy while being totally disengaged. To assuage the slight guilt he was feeling for avoiding her, he sent her flowers, thanking his lucky stars that her marriage to Pierre had landed her in Montreal, and she loved it there, and still lived there. If she was local and lacking his current address, she would be camped out in his office. Kevin was an internationally known photographer, Daniel the head of River's Edge. His company was a software engineering firm that had developed some of the best technologies used in the Alberta oil fields. In recent years, Daniel had applied his considerable ambition and business acumen to real estate and investing in young companies that he thought had potential, so he was not accustomed to being brushed off by a building manager who had told him, with a certain mean satisfaction, "I'll give you the tenant's name and phone number. You talk to her." The her in question was Patricia Marsh. When Daniel called, he had to shout to make himself heard over the caterwauling in the background. She'd sounded harried, exhausted, and she had been totally apologetic. Her nieces were visiting. They were from Australia. The difference in times meant that they were having trouble settling into a normal routine. She had promised changes, and Patricia Marsh had possessed one of those lovely, husky voices that might have inspired belief in one less jaded than himself. He had ended the call on a curt note, probably more because of being harassed by his mother than anything to do with Patricia Marsh, but oh well. None of the promised changes had materialized, so he was less and less sorry for the curt note. It was day 4, make that night 4, in the combat zone. There was sudden silence above his head, but instead of enjoying it, Daniel noted that his headache felt permanent, and his shoulders were bunched up with tension. So the visiting children were having a little break right now. He wished he could appreciate the silence, and he tried to. He closed his eyes, willed himself back to sleep. He was closing the Bentley deal tomorrow. Months of groundwork were coming to fruition. He needed to be razor-sharp and ready. He needed his sleep. But instead of sleeping, he contemplated the silence with deep suspicion, like a soldier waiting for the firing to start again. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. At half an hour of blissful silence, he took a deep breath and allowed himself to be lulled into a sense of security. The knot in his forehead relaxed ever so slightly, and he felt his shoulders unwind. Tomorrow, he'd go get a hotel for the duration of the children's visit.